The dust on the road into Crestfall, Colorado, was a fine, pale powder, the color of bone. It coated Clara Finch's worn boots and settled in the hem of her gray wool skirt, a constant reminder of the dryness that had seeped into everything this far up the mountain. The year was 1888, and the land was thirsty. So was she. In her satchel, two things of weight pressed against her hip, her late father's leather-bound journals, filled with his precise, elegant script on soil mechanics and hydrology, and the letter from a creditor in Denver. The letter was sharp, impatient. It demanded the $60 for her younger brother's apprenticeship bond, called in 6 months early. $60 she did not have. The Harlow Ranch was her last, desperate idea. It sprawled across a valley that should have been green but was instead a patchwork of brown and exhausted yellow. The main house was a solid timber structure, but even from a distance, it looked tired, hunkered down against the wind. A great barn, its spine sagging in the middle like an old horse, listed to one side. This was a place, like its owner, that was known for being broken. Wade Harlow was in the yard, wrestling with a piece of harness leather that had snapped clean through. He was 35, but frustration and 2 years of drought had carved deeper lines around his eyes. His shoulders were broad under a faded chambray shirt, a solid mass of muscle and bone, but he moved with the tight, angry energy of a man perpetually losing a fight. He did not look up when her shadow fell over his work. "I'm not hiring," he said, his voice a low growl of dismissal. 2 foremen had quit on him in as many seasons. The last one had called the land cursed and ridden out without collecting his final week's pay. "I'm not looking for a job as a hand," Clara said. Her voice was quiet but clear, and it made him finally look up. He saw a woman of maybe 25, plain but for a pair of startlingly direct gray eyes. There was no desperation in them, only a calm, measuring assessment that he found immediately irritating. "Then you're lost," he stated, turning back to the harness. "Town's that way. I'm Clara Finch. My father was Alistair Finch." The name gave him a moment's pause. Alistair Finch had been an engineer for the railroad, a man with a reputation for solving problems other men couldn't puzzle out. Wade had met him once, years ago. A good man. A smart man. "He's dead," Wade said, not unkindly. It was a fact, like the dead pasture. "Yes," Clara confirmed. "But his work isn't. I have his journals." She patted the satchel at her side. "I hear you have problems with your land. Problems your last 2 foremen couldn't fix." A bitter laugh escaped him. It was a harsh, unused sound. "Problems? Lady, I've got a bumper crop of problems. The north pasture's blowing away, the main irrigation ditch is poisoning the little I can get to grow, and that barn is one good wind from collapsing on my herd. Unless your father wrote down miracles, those journals won't help." She did not flinch from his tone. She simply looked past him, her gaze fixed on the ailing barn. "It's the foundation," she said, her voice distant, as if she were talking to herself. "The east corner. It's sitting on unstable soil, and the runoff from the hill is undermining it." He stopped his work. He stared at her. That was exactly what the last man had said, just before he'd tried to shore it up with 3 good timbers that had cracked in a month. "And your ditch," she continued, her eyes scanning the faint, greenish-black line of residue along the channel that ran from the creek. "It's not sabotage. There's a mineral seep up high. Looks like alkali. It's leaching into the water source. You can't brute force that. You have to filter it or divert it." Wade slowly lowered the piece of leather. He had spent a month riding his property lines with a rifle, convinced a neighbor was poisoning his water. The thought that it was just the land itself turning on him was somehow worse. He looked at her, at the dust on her sensible shoes, at the resolute set of her jaw. She was alone, clearly had little money, and yet she stood there diagnosing his ruin with the detached confidence of a physician. A wave of resentment, sharp and hot, washed over him. He was tired of being told what was wrong, tired of fixes that didn't hold. He wanted to send her packing, to be left alone with his failure. But a different, uglier impulse took hold. He wanted to see that calm certainty of hers break against the same rocks that had broken him. He gave her a cold, thin smile. "All right, Miss Finch. You talk a fine game. You think you can fix all this?" "I believe the principles are sound," she said carefully. "Principles don't stop a barn from falling," he scoffed. Then the idea, born of bitterness and a profound exhaustion, presented itself. It was cruel, and it was impossible, and for that reason he liked it. "I'll make you a wager. You've got until the summer cattle drive. That's 10 weeks. You get that barn stabilized, that water running clean, and that north pasture showing enough green to be worth a damn. You fix this ranch, and I'll marry you. Give you the cursed Harlow name to go with the cursed Harlow land." He expected her to recoil, to flush with anger or embarrassment. He expected her to leave. Clara stood silent for a long moment. Her gaze didn't waver from his. She was thinking, not reacting, and that in itself was disarming. Finally, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I don't want your name, Mr. Harlow," she said, her voice perfectly even. "I need $60 for my brother's future. You pay me $60 when the work is done, and we'll call the wager settled." He was so taken aback by her counteroffer that all he could do was stare. He had offered her a life, however broken, and she had negotiated it down to a stack of bills. It was the most profound kind of refusal. A refusal of him, of his name, of everything he was. And it was, he had to admit, a fair trade for a miracle. $60, he repeated, the words feeling flat and foolish in his mouth. "And board," she added. "I'll need a place to stay while I work." He gestured vaguely toward the main house. "The east room is empty. Supper is at 7. He watched her walk toward the house, her back straight, the satchel with her father's secrets held tight in her hand. He felt a grim satisfaction. She would fail. They all did. And when she did, he would be $60 richer, and she would learn that principles were just words on a page. The land didn't care for words. She did not start with grand plans. She started with a shovel and a bucket. For 2 days, Wade watched her from the porch or the corral, pretending to be busy with his own tasks. She spent hours in the north pasture, the one that was turning to dust. She wasn't plowing or seeding. She was digging small, precise holes, taking samples of the soil, crumbling the dry earth between her fingers, smelling it, even touching it to her tongue. She made notes in a small ledger, her brow furrowed in concentration. He saw her consulting her father's journals, her finger tracing lines of text and diagrams of root systems. It was a slow, meticulous process that looked nothing like the frantic work of his previous foreman. They had tried to fight the land. She was listening to it. One evening he found her at the supper table, a plate of his own sorry cooking untouched before her. She had a map of the ranch laid out, drawn on a piece of butcher paper, and was marking it with charcoal. "It's overgrazed," she said without preamble, as if they were in the middle of a conversation. "But that's not the whole story. The soil is compacted. Water can't penetrate. When it rains, it just sheets off, taking the topsoil with it. And the native grasses that hold the soil in place are gone." He grunted, forking a piece of salt pork into his mouth. "Told you it was blowing away." "It's washing away," she corrected gently. "Then blowing. You need to break up the hardpan, but a plow will just turn it over. You need to introduce organic matter. And you need to plant something with a deep taproot to break it up naturally and hold the soil." She talked about things like swales and terracing, words he'd never heard applied to a simple pasture. She proposed planting rows of hardy shrubs and trees as windbreaks. It sounded like gardening, not ranching. It sounded absurd. "There's no time for trees to grow," he said, the scorn thick in his voice. "Not for this season," she agreed calmly, "but for the next, and the one after that. Some problems require solutions that outlive the man who starts them." That quieted him. The idea was so foreign. Everything on a ranch was about the now. The branding, the drive, the sale. The thought of planting a tree that would only be useful in a decade was a kind of faith he had long since lost. The next week, she moved to the barn. She didn't bring in new timbers. She brought in a team of mules and a scraper. She spent a day digging a wide, shallow trench around the entire foundation, diverting the path of the runoff away from the sinking east corner. Then she hauled rocks from the creek bed, not large boulders, but stones of all sizes, and began laying a French drain, a concept she explained to him one afternoon when he found himself watching her, unable to look away. A trench filled with gravel and rock to redirect water underground. It was simple. It was elegant. And he knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that it would work. He found himself making excuses to be near where she was working. He'd mend tack in the barn doorway while she measured the sag in the main beam. He'd clean out the water trough near the irrigation ditch while she built her filter a layered trough of sand and charcoal and gravel that the creek water had to pass through before it entered the main channel. One afternoon, he saw her stop work and press a hand to the small of her back, a flicker of pain crossing her face. The work was hard, relentless. Before he could think about it, he was walking toward her. "Leave it," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I'll finish hauling these rocks." She looked at him, surprised. "It's my work. The wager." "The wager didn't say you had to kill yourself doing it," he cut in. He took the wheelbarrow from her. Her hands were raw and blistered. He felt a strange, protective pang. "Go inside. Read your books." She hesitated, then nodded. She did not thank him. But when he came in for supper that night, a plate of hot stew was waiting for him, thick with vegetables from the root cellar she had organized. And next to his plate was a small pot of salve. For his hands, he assumed. But looking at her own, he knew it was for both of them. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet. The space between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the shared weight of the day's labor, with the smell of the salve, with the unspoken acknowledgement that he had helped her. It was a shared quiet, comfortable and settled. The first sign of change came 4 weeks in. After a night of steady rain, the area around the barn was muddy, but not flooded. The new drain was working. The water, instead of pooling and sinking, was flowing harmlessly away toward the creek. Wade stood there for a long time, just looking at it. A week later, the water in the irrigation ditch ran clear. He cupped some in his hands. It was cold and clean, without the metallic, bitter taste it had carried for 2 years. He let it run over his fingers. A small, almost imperceptible hope began to stir in him. The north pasture took the longest. Clara had hired a man with a subsoiler plow from Crestfall, paying him with a small advance Wade had given her without a word, to cut deep lines into the compacted earth. Then she'd spent days broadcasting a mix of seeds he'd never seen before, clover, alfalfa, and some tough, wiry native grasses she'd harvested from the high country. It seemed a fool's errand, casting seeds onto dry, broken ground. But then it rained again, a soft, soaking rain that lasted for 2 days. When the sun came out, Wade rode out to the north pasture. And he saw it. A faint, tender green fuzz, like moss on a rock, was emerging from the cracked soil. Life. He dismounted and knelt, touching a tiny clover leaf with the tip of his finger. It was real. He looked back toward the ranch house, where a single light burned in the window of the east room. Clara would be at her desk, poring over her father's journals, planning the next step. She wasn't just fixing his ranch. She was breathing life back into it. And he was realizing, with a slow, dawning dread and something that felt terrifyingly like joy, that he didn't want her to stop. He didn't want her to ever leave. The $60 felt like an insult. The wager felt like a prophecy he had spoken in jest, not knowing it was the truest thing he had ever said. The town had noticed. When Wade went to the general store for supplies, Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, leaned over the counter. "Heard you got a new foreman, Wade," he said, a knowing glint in his eye. "A rather capable one." "She's not a foreman," Wade said, his tone sharp. "She's a consultant." Henderson just smiled. "Right. A consultant. Well, whatever she is, Elias Thorne was in here yesterday. Said your north pasture is looking greener than his. First time in 5 years anyone said that." He paused, bagging up some flour. "Town looks out for her, you know. Alistair Finch had friends here." It was a warning, however friendly. A reminder that Clara was not just some nameless drifter. She was a daughter of a respected man, and she was under the community's watchful eye. Wade felt a prickle of annoyance, followed by a surge of possessiveness that surprised him with its intensity. Of course, they were watching. How could they not? The real catalyst arrived on a Sunday, in a polished buggy pulled by a handsome bay gelding. Mr. Sterling, a dry goods merchant from Crestfall, had come calling. He was a man in his 40s, a widower, with a prosperous business and a slightly too satisfied air about him. He was dressed in a fine wool suit, and he held his hat in his hand as he spoke to Clara on the porch. Wade watched from the barn, his hands tightening on a piece of leather he was supposed to be oiling. Sterling was not looking at the recovering land or the stabilized barn. He was looking at Clara. He was complimenting her dress, her hair. He was talking about socials in town, about a life of comfort, a life away from the dirt and the endless work. He was offering her everything a woman was supposed to want. And Wade was the man who had offered her a marriage as a joke, a prize for mucking out his failures. He watched Sterling leave, and then he watched Clara as she stood on the porch, her expression unreadable. Did she want that life? A life of soft hands and Sunday socials? The thought was a physical pain, a sharp twist in his gut. He had grown accustomed to the sight of her in the evenings, her face smudged with dirt, her mind sharp as a tack, her quiet presence a steadying anchor in his own chaotic world. The thought of the house without her, the thought of his future without her in it, was suddenly, starkly unbearable. That evening his neighbor, Elias Thorne, rode over. Elias was a man in his 60s, his face a roadmap of sun and worry, but his eyes were shrewd. He and Wade had shared a fence line for 15 years. Elias didn't dismount, just sat his horse and looked out over the north pasture, where the new grass was now an inch high and thick enough to ripple in the breeze. "Seen Sterling's buggy leaving," Elias commented, his voice casual. Wade just grunted. "He's a good man. Sterling. Steady. Got a good head for business." Elias paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Looking for a wife. Someone to run his house, host his dinners." Wade said nothing, his jaw tight. Elias shifted in his saddle and looked directly at Wade. His gaze was blunt. "You have a remarkable inability to see what's standing right in front of you, Wade. That girl," he nodded toward the house, "she didn't just save your pasture. She saved this ranch. She saved you from becoming the bitter old man you were well on your way to being." He gathered his reins. "Some things are more valuable than cattle or land. A man would be a fool to put a price on them, or to let another man walk away with them because he was too slow to speak." Elias tipped his hat and rode off, leaving Wade standing in the middle of the yard, the truth of his words echoing in the quiet air. Slow. He was too slow to speak. That night, Wade didn't sleep. He lay in his bed and listened to the sounds of the house, the creak of the floorboards, the sigh of the wind. He thought of the past 10 weeks. He saw Clara, covered in dirt, hauling rocks. He saw her at the table, her face illuminated by lamplight, her mind 1,000 miles away, solving a problem he couldn't even see. He remembered the taste of the stew she'd made, the neat, strong stitches in a shirt she had mended for him without a word. It was a shirt he hadn't worn since, keeping it folded in a drawer, unwilling to risk breaking a single thread. These were not the actions of an employee. These were not the terms of a wager. This was the work of a partner. He had made a fool's bet, and she had called his bluff with competence and grace. She had held up her end of the bargain. The barn was solid, the water was clean, the pasture was alive. The summer cattle drive was in 2 days, and the herd would go out across land that was no longer dying. She had won. By the terms of his own stupid, arrogant wager, he owed her a proposal of marriage. But he knew with a clarity that cut through all his pride and bitterness that he didn't want to pay a debt. He wanted to give a gift. He wanted to offer her not his name as a prize, but his heart as a home. He wanted her to stay, not because she had earned it, but because he couldn't imagine a single day without her. The realization was so simple, so total, that it left him breathless. He was in love with Clara Finch. The next evening, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley. The new grass in the north pasture was bathed in a golden light. Clara was standing at the fence line, looking out over her work. The wind lifted a few strands of hair from the neat bun at the nape of her neck. He walked out to meet her. He had rehearsed no words. His mind was a blank slate, filled only with the terrifying, exhilarating certainty of what he had to do. She heard him approach and turned. Her expression was calm, expectant. She was not going to be the one to say any of this first. He stopped a few feet from her, his hat in his hands. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at her, at the quiet strength in her face. "The drive goes out tomorrow," he said. His voice was hoarse. "Yes," she said. "The herd looks strong." "They are," he agreed. "The land is good." He paused, searching for the words. "You won the wager, Clara." She gave a small nod, her eyes never leaving his. "The $60 then?" "No," he said, the word coming out sharper than he'd meant. He took a breath. "No, not the $60. He took a step closer, until he was standing at the fence beside her. The wager was a fool's talk, a bitter man's talk. I was a fool. He looked from her face to the land and back again. "You did more than fix this ranch," he said, his voice low and earnest. "You brought it back to life. You brought me back to life. I've been slow. Elias Thorne told me I was slow. He was right." He finally met her gaze, holding it. There was no hiding now. "I don't want to pay you. I don't want you to leave. Clara, I would like to stay. Here. With you. As your husband." He swallowed, the words feeling clumsy, inadequate. I love you." The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the new grass. He waited, his heart pounding against his ribs. He had laid his entire broken, hopeful self at her feet. A small, slow smile touched her lips, a smile of such warmth and gentle humor that it made his chest ache. "You got there, Wade," she said softly. Her hand came up and rested on his on the fence post. "I was beginning to wonder." He stared at her, the meaning of her words slowly dawning on him. She had been waiting. She had known. "Yes?" he asked, needing to hear it plainly. "Yes," she said, her smile widening. "Obviously, yes." They did not have a long courtship. There was no need for one. They had already spent 10 weeks learning the truth of each other, not through polite conversation and chaperoned walks, but through shared labor and comfortable silence. They had seen each other at their worst, he in his bitterness, she in her desperation, and had found their way to something better. They spoke to the circuit judge when he passed through Crestfall the next month. The wedding was held in the main room of the ranch house. Clara wore a simple dress, the color of the blue flax she had planted near the porch. Elias Thorne stood as Wade's witness, a broad, satisfied grin on his face. Her only attendant was the memory of her father, whose journals sat on the mantelpiece, a silent testament to the foundation they were all building on. There was no grand celebration, only a quiet dinner with a few hands and neighbors. But as Wade looked at Clara sitting across the table from him, her face glowing in the lamplight, he felt a sense of peace so profound, it was like coming home after a lifetime away. The $60 was never mentioned again. Instead, he signed the deed to the ranch over to both of them, Harlow and Finch. It had a good, solid ring to it. 5 years later, the Harlow and Finch ranch was one of the most prosperous in the valley. The pastures were lush and green, the barn stood straight and true, and the creek ran clean and full. Wade had learned to listen to the land, to see it not as an adversary to be conquered, but as a partner to be understood. He had learned it from Clara. They were sitting on the porch in the long twilight of a summer evening. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth and the wild roses Clara had planted along the fence. Wade was cleaning a rifle, the motions methodical and sure. Clara was mending a small pair of overalls, her stitches as neat and strong as ever. A boy of 4, with Wade's steady hands and dark hair, was carefully building a small dam in a puddle near the steps. A girl of 2, with Clara's observant gray eyes, sat beside him, handing him pebbles with solemn importance. Wade paused in his work, watching them. He felt a wave of contentment so deep it was almost painful. This life, this quiet, solid life, was more than he had ever known to hope for. The north pasture could use a controlled burn next spring, Clara said, not looking up from her mending. The undergrowth is getting thick. I was thinking the same thing, Wade replied. We could move the herd to the west slope for a few weeks. They fell into an easy silence, the conversation about the ranch as natural to them as breathing. He looked at her, at the way the fading light caught the silver in her needle. He remembered the arrogant, broken man who had made a foolish wager with a desperate woman. He had thought he was offering an impossible price. He had not understood that she was the prize, and he was the one who was being saved. You know, he said, his voice quiet, I'm still slow. She looked up then, a familiar, fond smile playing on her lips. Yes, you are. She folded the tiny overalls and set them aside. But you get there, and that has always been enough. She reached over and placed her hand on his. It was a gesture he knew well, a gesture of quiet understanding, of shared history, of a love that had been built not on grand pronouncements, but on 1,000 small, steady acts of care. It was a love as solid and as enduring as the land itself. That's the thing about respect, isn't it? It can be a quiet, unassuming seed. It doesn't announce itself with thunder and lightning, but plants itself in the soil of shared work and proven competence. And in the right conditions, tended with patience and quiet observation, it can grow into a love far stronger and more deeply rooted than any passion born of mere attraction. It's the kind of love that can mend a broken foundation, clear a poisoned stream, and bring a barren field back to life. Thank you for riding with me today. I'm grateful you were here. Until next time, keep riding.